let me ask you all a question. Teens, when should the engagement and the motivation begin? At the start of the course, at the start of the lesson, or as they leave the classroom? What do you think? Any ideas? Thank you very much. Lots of people answering start of the course, definitely. In fact, it is a little bit of a trick question because, to be perfectly honest, for me, it should begin at all of these moments. Certainly at the start of the course, when they join us for the first time. Often students are quite motivated at the start of the course because everything could be new for them. Please bear in mind my teaching context. I work in academies, so I'm dealing with children who come to learn English usually after school. What does this mean? It means that they could be very tired. It also means that they could be sent here by their parents, but it also means that often they enjoy coming, they're motivated, and they often repeat year after year. But we have a new class each year. We don't tend to repeat courses. We work with a new group of students, and I think it's very important that obviously we motivate them at the start of the course. At the start of the lesson, when they come in, very important that we immediately begin with a motivating activity. I always try to begin with an oral fluency activity to get them speaking in English, to get them to sort of switch the chip and to be in the English zone. And that's something that we'll be looking at in a moment. Also, as they leave the classroom, we don't want students to be leaving the classroom feeling very stressed, shall we say, about perhaps the amount of homework that you've given them. I don't know about in your context, but I'm sure it's very similar to mine that students have a lot of exams to do at school, as well as perhaps preparing for preliminary or first certificate, etc., outside of school. And they are often feeling a little bit overloaded. So I always try to have them leave the classroom with a clear idea of what they need to do at home, but also with a motivating activity to make them feel good and get them wanting to come back, of course. Okay. Now, there are quite a few questions about, is it about inner motivation? Some very nice questions coming in there. I think motivation, clearly we have the inner motivation, the intrinsic motivation, which some students, particularly those who are good at English, shall we say, bring into the classroom. But I think it's very important that those who have come to class, particularly because they've been sent by their parents, because they need to improve, etc., or have been sent to class and for them it is another lesson at the end of the day, that we engage them and that we turn that extrinsic motivation, which they may have, into intrinsic motivation because they feel successful and fulfilled in what they're doing in class and they can see progress. Okay, so let's have a look at an activity which I'd like you to do with me. In my session today, we'll be doing some activities and I'll be asking you to participate. So thank you very much for any cooperation. Okay, so here is some information about me. As you can see, you have some numbers. 29 years referring to a job, 26 years referring to a place, 15 years referring to sport, 16 referring to my family, 7 referring to music, and 14 to 16-year-olds referring to a class. Could you have a look at these numbers and think, what could they be about? Why are they relevant for me? Okay, so could you make some predictions? I will just give you a few seconds to do that. What do you think this could all be about? Okay, talking about different aspects of my life: job, place, sport, family, music, and a class. Oh, there's some fantastic predictions coming in. Someone says I may have been jogging for the last 15 years. Somebody talks about me living in the same place for 26 years. Someone's saying 16 years of marriage. Someone is saying I have a 16-year-old child. Someone is asking if I've been living in Spain for 26 years. Oh, I love the one who says 14 to 16-year-old your age. I wish. That's a lovely prediction, but unfortunately that one is not true. Okay. So many interesting predictions. Okay, well, I'm going to now tell you a little bit about myself. and you can listen and find out the answers, okay, and see how correct you were with your predictions. So I first started teaching English in 1991. This is when I did my initial training course in Bristol in England, which is the city which my family are originally from. And after doing my training course, I moved to Japan, where I taught English for 2 years. And that was an amazing experience, very fulfilling. I learned a lot about being a teacher, but I also learned an awful lot about the Japanese culture, the Japanese people. It gave me the opportunity to travel, to visit different areas of Japan, etc. And also different parts of Asia. I was very fortunate. And then, after 2 years in Japan, in 1994, I moved here to Spain. And I began teaching in Cordoba, which is a city, a medium-sized city, about 80 miles from Seville, where I am based. And I worked and was very happy working in Cordoba at International House there for 5 years, where I taught teenagers, children, adults, completed my Delta course, etc. And I was there for 5 years. And then in 1999, I moved here to Seville, where I have been working ever since at International House here. And as I mentioned before, not only working on teacher training courses, but also teaching students of different ages. In my free time, I love traveling. I'm sure many of you feel the same. And I also enjoy going to the gym. I'd like to say that I've been going to the gym for 15 years, but that's not true. In fact, it's something I've been doing a lot recently. I've lost quite a lot of weight, very proud of myself. But the main reason why I love sport is I have 2 older brothers, and from a very young age, they took me to watch a lot of football matches. And when I moved to Seville, I started watching Sevilla, and in 2005, I got my Seville season ticket holder. And that is one of the things that I do in my free time. I spend a lot of time watching Sevilla Football Club, have made lots of Spanish friends through that, etc. In terms of family, well, I have a big family, and I have in the UK 7 nephews and nieces, and a lot of them are now grown up and they have children. And in total, there are 14 of them. And here in Spain, I also have 2 Spanish nephews and nieces. So as you can imagine, when it comes to birthdays and Christmas, it can be rather expensive. Okay. And finally, I should also mention my other hobby, music. I love listening to music, and I always try to go to concerts. And last year, I was lucky enough to go to a good number of concerts, usually Spanish groups. I like to listen to the local music scene, and I think in total, I went to 7 concerts last year. So there's some information about me. Hopefully it has helped you to check your predictions. Some of you were right about some of these numbers, well done. Some others have different ideas. I really like some of your ideas, but they weren't exactly the ones that I was then telling you about. Let's have a look then. Let's just check together. Okay, so as you can see, number of years teaching English, number of years living in Spain, number of years I've had my Sevilla season ticket, my numbers of nephews and nieces between Spain and the UK, the number of concerts, and these are the age of my students in my current B2 preparation group. So this group of students are preparing for the first certificate exam next year. And they're the ones that I'm working with at the moment. As I say, previous years, I've also worked with students preparing for PET, the preliminary exam as it's now called, etc. So well done, okay, if you managed to get quite a few of those correct. Quite a few of you saying yes, etc. Lovely. Could you just think about why this kind of activity, which we have just done together, we would do in class. Here are some of my ideas. You might have some others, okay? For example, I think that it's really important that the teacher builds rapport with their students. I would never ask my students to discuss things which I'm not prepared to discuss myself. So I did reveal quite a lot of information there about myself, and I'm quite happy to do that with my students. I want them to know me as a person, not just as a teacher, because I think if you can build engagement and mutual trust, it also aids you with areas of class management, etc. Whereas if you're just seen as this authority figure, then it doesn't always have the most positive effect when it comes to class management, etc. There's a few people saying that they can't hear me very well, and there's some disturbance. I just thought I'd mention that in case anything can be done about that. I think it's all clear at this end. Going back to why do this activity in class, I always find that students tend to come into class and that they sit with their friends and they tend to work with the same people. I'm sure you do activities where we try to move them around and get them to work with other people. I think it's really important to help the students to see that actually somebody who they may not typically work with or is not within their friends group might have a lot in common with them. And I think that this kind of activity where they share information may aid them to see that in fact they've got more in common than they realise, helps to build a rapport within the class, etc. Another aim here, but this is an aim obviously as a teacher, is these kinds of activities in which students are using a range of language freely, talking about the present, i.e. hobbies, family, talking about the past possibly. I mean, I talked to you about my previous teaching experience, etc. Allows you to listen into their use of language, and it allows you to see which areas of grammar they're using well, which they're having more problems with, maybe which they're not using as well. It helps you to spot gaps in their language. Also, it allows you to see the range of vocabulary that they are using, to identify those typical problems. For example, here in Spain, we often have issues with things like adjective order, use of certain present perfect, the use of the present perfect for incomplete time, for example, and it allows you to see what students are using well and what they're not using. Okay. I think the prediction element is fun. It engages the students, it motivates them to listen to you as the teacher and also to listen to each other. I would get the students to do this activity exactly the same as I did with you. And I would get them to write down the numbers which are relevant for them, to show them to another student. I would get them perhaps mixing and mingling out of their seats, working with a student that they don't actually work with usually, because also you don't want them to be working with somebody who's going to know all of the answers either, and get them to make predictions, get them to tell each other, to interact, etc. Also, all of the sort of topics which we just mentioned are the sorts of things that they might be asked about in oral exams at the start of the preliminary exam and the first two parts, also first certificate, etc. This also means that they get the opportunity to share the sort of information for you to listen to how they're using the language and then to help them prepare a little bit better for the oral exam. A couple of people are sending me messages saying that they couldn't see the slide earlier. I'll just show you it again if I can. Here we are. So I gave this information about me, and the students needed to make predictions. What could this be relevant for? I then told you about myself. You all listened out, identified why these numbers were relevant, and now we've just been talking about why do this kind of activity in class. Okay, thank you. So hopefully that is a useful activity for you. Moving on, let's hope that this connects up okay. So I also think that prediction is a useful skill to develop, not only to engage students, but also it's one that we really do need to encourage them to use when they are approaching exams. because so often we're giving them activities such as this reading skills activity from the preliminary exam, whereby they're having to read information, match up to other pieces of information. And quite often, looking at all the possible answers can be distracting. So I try to encourage my students to read the information and start thinking about what could the answer be, whether it's a reading activity like this one, or whether it's a listening skills activity, multiple choice. The problem with all of these multiple choice activities is that 3 out of 4 answers or 2 out of 3 answers are wrong and are distractors. So I think the sooner that we can also get the students to start looking at what information they've been given and thinking about what information am I likely to find to help me to complete this successfully could be very useful. So here is an example. This is taken from the B1 Optimise book, which is just out from Macmillan, which is preparing students for the preliminary exam. Here you can see information about Mario and Heidi, and the question is which winter activity would suit these teams. I would encourage my students to read this information and to start thinking about possible winter activities. Some of you are beginning to give ideas already. Could you just have a quick look? What kind of winter activity do you think could suit Mario? And what kind of winter activity do you think could suit Heidi? Okay, just give it some thought. Lovely, some ideas coming through. Maybe Heidi likes climbing and snowboarding. How about Mario? Oh, Mario could possibly go to the aquarium. Weights for Heidi. Okay, lovely. Mario, indoor swimming. Lovely. Got some good ideas coming through here. So, of course, you get your students to make predictions, and then you think, okay, now they need to look at the possible options. But hopefully those predictions will help them to recognize an answer which is similar to what they've already thought of and help them to dismiss distractors more easily. Okay, Mario indoor skating, ice hockey, lovely. Let's have a look at the options. These are the options given: sledging, ice skating, 10-pin bowling, indoor rock climbing, curling, winter photography, the aquarium, and board games. Okay, so this was the information given. Now, in the book, you've got a description of each of these activities in more detail. I haven't included it in the slide because it would be too much information to read. Okay, but we just go back again. So Mario would like to learn something about environmental problems. He doesn't want to be outside. He's interested in sea life and like to study it one day. Heidi enjoys being outdoors, but does not want to when it's cold. She likes to keep fit and does a lot of exercise. She wants an activity that will make her stronger. She isn't afraid of heights and enjoys challenges. Okay, so those were our options. As I say, do bear in mind that you would have more information about these in the book. And here are the answers. So I think somebody said that about Heidi, some rock climbing, indoor rock climbing. With Mario, it suggested winter photography, although I must admit the aquarium does sound like a good idea as well. Bear in mind we're missing a little bit of information here. But the whole point is just to demonstrate the fact that with these kinds of activities, whether it's reading or listening, where they have to listen, read, are given various options and make choices, so often the students begin straight away by looking at all the options, and it can just make it quite confusing. I think we have to look at the initial information, what do we think, make some predictions, then look at the options. It allows us to eliminate some of the answers which clearly aren't going to be correct. Okay, some of you are actually disputing some of the answers. Absolutely fine, that's great. That's what happens in class, isn't it? Your students might question some of the answers and say why they feel that indoor rock climbing wouldn't be for Heidi, or why winter photography would be, or rather why the aquarium would be more appropriate for Mario. Obviously, in the information in the text, there will be keywords which will help give those answers. But the whole point is, even if they're disputing it and discussing it in English, it could be an opportunity to practice language for giving opinion, agreeing, disagreeing, etc. Someone's asking me about sledging. We would do this in winter. This is when you sit or ride. I think you think about Santa Claus sitting in his big sledge being taken along by the reindeer. Well, sledging actually would just be a much smaller version of that, sometimes even an old tray where you travel down a hill or well, I say a mountain, it'd be a bit dangerous, a mountain on the ice. That's what sledging's all about. Yes, someone says it's what Santa does. Thank you, Macmillan. Exactly. Lovely. Okay, so prediction. Making predictions to engage students, whether it's an oral activity with you or making predictions before a reading skills activity or a listening skills activity to help students to then not get distracted by incorrect answers which are given in the options. Let's move on. Okay. So, my next question to you is, do you find out about your learners' interests? I realise that you might be teaching very large classes. My context is a little bit different. We have a maximum of 12 students in a class, and I realise you may have 3 times that many, if not more. However, you might be working with your students all year, so you might have a little bit more time. For in my case, for example, my first certificate group I see twice a week for 3 hours in total. You probably have much more interaction with your students than I do. But I'd like to know, do you find out about your students' interests? How do you do it? And how can this information be taken into account when selecting coursebook material? That's what I'd like to ask you. Somebody's just said that they use quizzes. That's very interesting. So maybe a kind of quiz to find out about their interests. It could be their general interests, of course. It could be finding out about what they like, what topics they're interested in, etc. Or it could be more to find out about their interests in terms of learning English. Possibly both. You might have more of a needs analysis to help them, or rather to help you to discover what they feel they're not so strong at and stronger at when it comes to English. And obviously your own observations are very important with this as well. Or it could be that you're using activities, questionnaires, quizzes, etc., to find out more about them in terms of what they generally like. And some very nice ideas coming through here. It depends on the class, of course. It could depend on the number in the class. It could depend if it's a very specialised class or not. Personalised charts, video presentations, dialogues. Some really nice ideas coming through here. Making a poster presentation with mind maps. That's a lovely idea from Alessandra there. So this is, it's important to try to find out, I feel, about your students so that you can cater for them. In terms of the course book, then I'm sure many of you do use course books in class. I'm sure many of you have the same issue that I often have, and the issue being that I don't always complete all of the course book within the time allocated. So I might be using a course book which has 12 units, and due to the fact that we might do additional exam practice, the fact that we also perhaps do other fluency type activities and some lessons using supplementary materials, I might find that I only get to the end of unit 9 or 10, when in fact it is important to cover everything in the book in terms of perhaps the areas of grammar and lexis, vocabulary, which could well come up on the course and in the exam. So one thing that I do at the beginning of the course is give my students the course books, and let's just see if that one turns over. Yes, here are some examples of course books, and I get them to look through the course book and to choose units which they think will be interesting for them and units which they don't feel they would be interested in. Now, in terms of what the criteria is for doing this, I let them decide. Many of them choose the units based on the topics, okay? So it could be that they see a unit on the environment, which they find interesting, a unit on travel, which they find interesting, maybe a unit on extreme sports, which they don't find interesting. So it could be that they rank the units according to the things which they find interesting topic-wise. And then they do the same with three units which they don't find so interesting. It could also be that students decide which ones they find more interesting or they don't feel are so relevant based on what's being covered. I get them to look at the contents page. I get them to look at the grammar, the vocabulary, the skills being covered. So for example, they might say, Claire, the first 2 units are just review of what we were doing at the end of last year, and we have done these areas of grammar a lot. It's getting to know you activities. We were all together last year. So it could depend also on that. And I think that consulting them, getting some input from them can be important, not only to give you information, but also to feel that they are giving some input into the course. And I think this helps to motivate. Now, it's true, there are many questions coming through. What do you do if all the answers are different? Funnily enough, I mean, I've done this a number of times, a good number of times, and generally there are always some units which they all say they're very interested in, and there's usually a couple of units which, well, I say all, the majority would say that they're not interested in. So it's true to say that it is an effective activity. I think it also does allow you to find out about specific students and something that they might be particularly interested in, which nobody else is, if it's a topic. And then you can always consider that when you're giving homework activities. You might give some personalized text so that you are giving them a text, maybe a vocabulary closed text, one of the texts which we have in the reading and use of English papers, where they have to read and choose which is the most appropriate piece of vocabulary for the gap. Maybe you can find one which is on a topic that they're interested in, etc. Okay. Somebody's asking questions about what if the texts rely on sequential instruction? That's a very good point. What I'm saying is don't ignore what's in those units. If you decide not to do the unit from the book, I'm not saying ignore the grammar, ignore the lexis, but maybe you need to think of another way in which it can be introduced. Maybe using some of those topics which you've discovered they're interested in when you've done your questionnaires, your quizzes, etc. Does it involve some extra work for the teacher? Yes, it does. But I think you'll find that the level of motivation, etc., will be higher if you're using a personalised context to introduce an area of grammar which makes it more memorable. And with that being the case, it then means that students are more likely to remember your marker sentences, your key sentences which contain examples of the grammar, and it makes it more accessible to them, rather than using perhaps a topic in a book which none of them say they're interested in. Okay, something for you to experiment with. It may work, it may not, it might be difficult when you have such large classes, I understand that. But rather than never getting to unit 11, why not choose those units which they're more interested in, and then just picking some of the key pieces out of those units which you don't look at, and looking at them in a different way, whether it's grammar or lexis or a particular kind of skills lesson. So here are some tips. Discussions also. What do they like and what do they not like doing in class? At the beginning of this year, I got my students to write me an email. Oh, that's jumped on another. Let's go back to this one. I got them to write me an email telling me about themselves, an informal email, but also what they enjoy doing in class, what they don't enjoy doing, what they think they're strong at, what they think they're not so strong at. Interestingly, their perspective on what they feel they're strong at and not so strong at isn't always the same as I then perceive it when I see them in class. So there can sometimes be a mismatch there, that they think they're no good at listening when in fact they are really quite good for the level. They sometimes notice things that they don't understand rather than they do, for example. But I think we need to consult them. Also, I try to use positive statements about using English for them to respond to. For example, what can English help them to do, especially those students who perhaps wouldn't have chosen to come to English class after school if they hadn't been sent by their parents. So, for example, they might be really into music, really into American music, for example. And so, why is English important? Oh, well, it can help me to understand the lyrics. songs are such a memorable way of using a language. Unfortunately, I'm ashamed to admit I remember very little from my French lessons at school, but I do remember the words to songs like Frère Jacques. Probably said that incorrectly with pronunciation, apologies. And songs can be motivating. A lot of our students these days are playing online, playing video games, etc., and it's in English, and study abroad trips, etc. And also, obviously, English can help me to pass exams to show a level of ability, be it B1, B2, C1, etc., which could be very important for their future, for getting university qualifications, etc. Okay, let's move on, and excuse me one moment, here we go. Okay, so at the start of a lesson, we need to create interest in the topic. We've just been talking also about it at the start of the course, haven't we? So now, at the start of the lesson, I'm looking here at a unit from Optimise B2, Invent and Innovate. This is a topic I recently did with my students. And here is a question for you. What is the most important invention? Do you think it's the light bulb, the wheel, the computer, or the mobile phone? The reason that I've given you these four is these are the four that my students came up with the week before last in class. Some of them went for very old inventions like the wheel, the light bulb. Some of them went for the more modern inventions like the computer and the mobile phone. What do you think is the most important and why? Obviously, the students were discussing this. They're practicing using language of opinion. They're also doing some problem solving skills work because they have to decide which they would choose and why, which is a similar task to those that they have to do in the oral exams. It's really interesting to see your answers coming through. We have a real mixture. Some of you are saying the mobile phone. That was a very popular answer in my class. Of course, the students all thought it was hilarious when I told them that I could remember life without the mobile phone. Back when I worked in Japan, they were just being invented, and I remember going on a trip to Hong Kong and seeing people walking around with these huge phones in their hands, and me thinking, what are those? So yes, my students often laugh with me, and sometimes they laugh at me. I don't mind that. I like them to know all about my opinion on things. So I was, of course, saying, oh, wow, we could live without mobiles. I remember the day. They also came up with some really good reasons as to why they felt the light bulb or the wheel were the most important. It made them really search deeply using a good range of language to express their ideas. And this was, as I say, the sort of definitive list that they came up with because it was, let's try and find the top four. Okay, lots of you are making comments, a mobile. Some are saying they think they would choose a computer. I think those who chose a mobile phone were arguing that it acts as a computer as well as a telephone, a camera, etc. Okay, for me, the child who gave the best opinion presented their idea most effectively was in fact the child who was supporting the idea of the wheel. But anyway, so we began with this. What did they think, etc. And then we moved on to looking at them coming up with their own invention. Now, what I did here was I gave them a model, and hopefully we're going to see this model in a moment. Please bear with me because I need to connect up to the YouTube video. Hopefully it will go well. But just to explain, it's a program called Dragon's Den, which is on television, I think in many countries. This is taken from the UK. And there were some young inventors coming in to sell their invention. And you have some experts who are called the dragons listening to the presentation and deciding whether or not they wanted to invest in the invention or not. So what I'm going to just try to do is connect up to this YouTube video. Please bear with me a moment. And let's see if we can get it. Here we are. Hopefully you are able to see this. There might be an advert first, hopefully not. Okay, so here are these two young sisters, and they're going to be making a presentation about their invention. My question to you is, would you invest in it if you were the dragons? Can you all see it?
I'm Kate Ballantyne, and this is my sister Sky. We're here today to ask for £25,000 in return for 10% of our company, Crikey Bikey Limited. Our company has two directors, my mum, Ali Ballantyne, and a family friend, Jeremy Wilson. Sky and I both hold 50% of the shares. We started our company because we really believe that our harness can help teach children how to ride their bikes much quicker.
When I heard that my holiday homework was to invent something for a school technology competition, I thought, wow, I'm really going to go for this. I was wondering what to do when I noticed a man teaching his son to ride a bike in the park. The man was struggling because he was bent over holding the back of the seat and the handlebars, and he was getting a bad back.
Sky created the Crikey Bikey harness, a harness with a handle on the back, which allows the adult to run with a straight back. If the child wobbles, they can feel the safety of the harness around them.
We have registered the Crikey Bikey trademarks. We know that our product is unique because we have applied for a UK patent and we have asked for it to be accelerated.
We'd now like to invite on our directors to help us answer any questions you may have.
Thank you.
Okay, now I think a lot of you have been able to see it. Some of you haven't been able to see it. It's, for those of you who weren't, it's a harness to attach to the back of a bike so that when a child is learning to ride, a parent can hold on to the harness which is attached to the child and the bike so that they don't bend their backs and have back problems. So could you, those of you who were able to watch it, quite a lot of you were, could you decide what do you think happened? Do you think the dragons decided to invest in it or not? Whilst you're deciding, I will go back to the presentation. Okay. Lovely. Lots of you are saying yes, you would invest in it. I think it's a wonderful idea, very simple. And apparently, they decided not to invest in it because if they invest in it, it means that they will then get some of the profits. But one of the dragons actually has a web page where he sells many different kinds of apparatus and devices for bikes, and apparently it is incredibly successful with all the bike shops, so he offered to market it for them. So there was some investment, but from a marketing point of view. Okay, so that's a video. How did I use it? Well, I used it so that the students could see a model, and then they went on to come up with their own inventions. And this allowed them to think about the kind of language that you use to try to persuade, to sell, etc. Descriptive language, lots of vocabulary that they may well use in an exam context. Also, they were making suggestions, things like that, when they were making their presentations. And there were some really nice ideas. And the thing is, it tied in with the unit which was in the book. In the unit in the book, also, there were, later on in the unit, there were some examples of uses of the passive, which we often use when we're talking about invention. So we then revisited the passive. We had a look at that kind of language too. And it was just a way of bringing the topic to life, to get them to use some language. We focused, of course, on some of the language which was being used, including some phrasal verbs, language of persuasion, language of making suggestions, etc. I'm being asked, do you build the language up on the board? Yes, what I actually did in this lesson is we had different exponents of language up on the board, and they also had a handout. They also had a handout to take away. and they had to match up the examples with the function. So for example, to convince, to make a suggestion. They also had some match-up activities for things like the phrasal verbs, etc. And they worked together on this. We looked at the language. I helped them with the pronunciation, because of course what we want them to do is we then want them to use this language when they're making their presentation. So it's important that they know how to use the language, not only how it sounds, but things like the intonation, etc. I think one of the reasons why these two young girls made such a good presentation was because of the way that they were able to stress keywords, their intonation, etc. And it was a lesson which I felt worked well, tied in nicely with the topic in the book, led on to a focus on things such as passives. Okay, hope you found it useful. Let's move on. For those of you who are joining us now, I'm afraid I started rather late because of a problem with a connection. Hopefully we still have time to do a couple of activities. I will just confirm the time which we will be finishing. Okay, the next speaker needs to speak very shortly, apparently. All right, okay, so I will be wrapping up just in a moment, okay? This activity here is taken from a video which many of you might be familiar with. It's a very well-known film, and there's a scene whereby a man has been left to babysit, a man called Greg, who has no idea how to babysit, and the baby won't stop crying. And therefore, we watch the video, we decide what the problem is, and we decide what kind of grammar area this could be exploited for. Some of you may well be familiar with this clip. I'm afraid I don't have time to play it now. I'm so sorry about that. But this poor man tried to get this baby to stop crying, and in his frustration, he says a bad word. And what happens? The baby, who is just about to learn to speak, hears a bad word and starts repeating it again and again. And it's the baby's first word. So if you put into YouTube, Meet the Fockers baby's first word, this scene comes up. It's very funny. And the man, of course, is really worried that this baby is going to produce this word with the parents, which of course is what happens. But then we look at the language that we can use, language to reflect hypothetically. Third conditional, wishes, he should have, he shouldn't have. Greg wishes he hadn't agreed to babysit. If only he hadn't said that bad word. He should, he shouldn't have tried to stop the baby from crying. He could have picked the baby up, etc. I use this with my teens. This was with a preliminary level class. It's a difficult area of grammar. They really remembered. We looked at the third conditional. Yeah, if Greg hadn't said the bad word, the baby wouldn't have repeated it. They remembered the sentence. We looked at the structure.